Welcome to the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had but never got, part 18. As I've been reminding everybody, it is important to listen to the discussions that we're having from beginning to end. The best way you can find it is to Google my YouTube channel, and then on that channel there's a playlist. The first video is called Chosson and Kallah Shmooze, etc. Intro, and from there automatically the playlist will continue one after another. It's vitally important because as we continue we talk about more and more sensitive material, and these items really require a foundation of context and to understand how to apply all of this. You can't discuss sexual intimacy without having the foundations of other forms of intimacy and even understanding how the Torah works. So we try to cover whatever we can. By the way, yesterday's discussion, I didn't have Amar Mokum completely correct. The reference to fasting is actually most explicit in the Kaf HaChaim in Siman Tovkav Ein Ches, Sivkat and Gimel. Over there, he's quite explicit that he says that if you are fasting and you are hungry and then you get angry when you're fasting, it's better that you should not fast and be in a good state and a pleasant state and not get angry with people. Now, he may be referring to voluntary fasts, not necessarily to obligatory fasts, but that's just a technicality, because in an obligatory fast you may have to fast anyway, but he's still stating a value statement, which is that abstention, and it can be applied to many things, abstention, if it puts you in a bad state and causes you to be irritable and not get along with people, the value of the abstention is much more limited. And therefore, it's very important that we understand in this context the meaning and the value of these various abstentions, because we have been studying this confusing and difficult aspect of Torah Shebaal Peh, where on the one hand there is tremendous emphasis on abnegation, on abstention, on not indulging in lust, and then on the other hand, at least if you're an Ashkenazi, the Ramah comes out saying that even though all that is really the right way, technically one is permitted to conduct themselves according to their taste and according to their needs within the confines of a marriage and a consenting relationship between two married people, meaning obviously one cannot force the other to be involved in something sexual that they're not comfortable with, but assuming they're keeping the halachas of Taras and Mishpacha, and they are both in agreement and comfortable with what they're doing, the Ramah says technically it's mutter, even though it is in some way discouraged. So how do we figure all this out? So we're going to continue to discuss some of these key concepts. And the Ramban, well, it's really not the Ramban, it's the Miyuchas Ramban, the Igeres HaKodesh, which many people think is the Ramban. It's, at this point, not necessarily clear that it was the Ramban. It's probably clear that it was not the Ramban, but in any case, it's an extremely valued document. And in the Igeres HaKodesh, he makes this point that if two people are sexual, lamalos tavosam, that if two people basically are lustful and they're sexual just to fill their desires, then through that fire will come into the relationship. Not a good fire, a destructive fire. And he says the well-known vart of Ish and Isha, between a man and a woman, there's a Shechina between them, the Yud K, right? Because in Hebrew, Ish is spelled Aleph Yud Shin, and a woman is spelled Aleph Shin Hey. So you have the Yud and you have the Hey. You have basically Hashem's name between a man and a woman. And he says if you take away Hashem, meaning if you do it only for the sake of lust, then all you have left is Eish. All you have left is fire. Now, it's important to understand that clearly the Ramban's concept of lust was, at least in writing, not particularly nuanced. In other words, what the Ramban would transmit to his children, to his students, is an interesting question. And again, it's not really the Ramban anyhow. It's probably the Ravid. But what that would be transmitted might be a little bit different than in writing. The writing is not particularly nuanced. The writing is basically implying that lustful, desirous behavior is destructive. However, what's important to reflect on is, again, are we talking about sexual pleasure or sexual lust? And it is fair to say that his language is that only to fulfill their desire, meaning he's talking about a selfish process. And as we have mentioned before, sexuality is on a continuum from actual masturbation to sexuality that's masturbation-like, in a sense that it's only about gratification, to, very high levels of love and connection. And that I do think that it's important, while it's not that explicit within these words, the most odious and the most despicable is just for lust, just to fulfill one's desires. It doesn't say much about feeling love and feeling connection and feeling passion. And that might be a word that's not so easy. English and Hebrew don't necessarily translate perfectly, and so it's hard to say whether that word is exactly what it sounds like to our ears. But it's important to know. And again, like I quoted the Kaf HaChaim in the beginning, the Kaf HaChaim saying that the point of any abstention is to create harmony between oneself, humility, connection to God, good relations between others by being humble. Clearly, if these abstentions cause other types of fight and difficulty, then it's wiser to rely on the Ramah, because that's certainly not what's being desired here. Now, the Ravid, in what's known to be the Ravid, Sefer Bali Nefesh, he actually delineates 4 different intentions for sexuality, each one going down in degree. So starting from the most laudable and the highest to the lowest. So he starts with the first is in order to fulfill the mitzvah of pru'arvu, of being fruitful and multiply, to be sexual in order to do that, and also to do the mitzvah of pleasing one's wife. So it's an interesting question. Again, we explored this in a previous discussion. Is that mitzvah? Certainly in actual legal structure, the mitzvah is only from a man to a woman, but we talked about the possibility that conceptually it goes both ways. It's just that the Torah is being very explicit about protecting the rights of a woman, because it's less likely that she would be able to assert herself and have her needs met. And we compared it to a pasuk in Mishpatim about not afflicting a orphan and a widow. Rashi over there says it's not just an orphan and a widow, it's anybody. But the Torah was talking about the one who's the underdog, who is less likely. So it could be, even in this first level of purity that the Ravid is talking about, the mitzvah could be to give pleasure to somebody else. Now, if the mitzvah is on both sides, and I say that with a big if, because that is a bit of a chiddush, but if it is, then what we're saying is each person should focus on the other person's pleasure. But obviously, you can't focus on the other person's pleasure unless the other person is actually receiving pleasure. So it would seem, even though, again, it's not so nuanced in the text, it would seem that even in the first intention, there is room for pleasure. But the point is that the intention is to give the other pleasure. That's what it would seem. Then the second emphasis is what he calls tikkun havolat, because there is an understanding that that the last 6 months of pregnancy helps the formation of the fetus. Having sex helps. I'm not sure what our doctors would have to say about that, but we have our own tradition, and there's enough people that follow all kinds of homeopathic remedies and various other kinds of unproven kinds of medical techniques. Well, we're entitled to our own too. So according to us, sexuality seems to be helpful to the formation and development of the fetus for the last 6 months of pregnancy. And if that's your intention, he says that's also good. Now, again, by extension, from a psychological point of view, anything that creates a solid bond between the married couple will also help not necessarily the physical formation of the fetus, but the formation and development of the fetus and the child. The neurological environment, the hormonal soup that the fetus is basically living in is his or her mother's hormones and emotions. And so one must consider, if there's not shalom bayis, if there's not peace and harmony, if there's anxiety, stress, and depression, what impact that has on the neurological development of the fetus, and certainly on the infant, and certainly on the young developing child. So sexuality, to create a bond and to create a connection between two people, is, I think, fairly legitimately within intention number 2 of the Ravid. Again, explicitly, the Ravid just says for the sake of helping the development of the fetus, and he has in mind explicitly, I can't tell you what he has in mind. He has in mind explicitly, the text, I should say, has in mind the medical idea that the Gemara understood. It's a tradition from the sages that it helps the formation of the fetus. But I do believe, again, that there's many things that cannot be given over in writing, and I do think that within this statement, and maybe even deeply within the wisdom of the sages, was also the emotional and neurological development of the fetus, both during pregnancy and also postpartum. So then we come to intention number 3. So we're going again, according to the Ravid, there's levels of intention, each one less as good as the one before, but still good, meaning he's talking about approved and appropriate intentions, not inappropriate intentions. So the third one is, even if there isn't any particular, bonding that's being created to help the child, and even if there's no pru or vu, even if there's no fulfillment of be fruitful and multiply, the Ravid says if just a man sees that his wife is in some way feeling desirous, it's a mitzvah to fulfill her desire. Now, this is interesting, understanding what this really means, why this is only about a woman. I do suspect, again, in the deepest sense, there is a real fear that a woman who is naturally less assertive, and certainly in earlier times far less assertive, most of us don't really get, even if we come from very traditional societies where we believe that we're living, according to whatever you want to call it, Yisrael, Saba, the ancient ways. We don't even understand the degree in which women in most of the world throughout most of history conducted themselves voluntarily or non-voluntarily. The fact of the matter is that less than 102, 103 years ago, women didn't even go to any type of school to study Torah. They didn't go to a cheder. They didn't go to anything. It's only Sarah Schneer that started that. Until then, they really didn't study Torah. They were literate. Many were literate because that's a very strong Jewish tradition. But they really did not study. Forget about today, women learning Gemara. They didn't study Chumash. They maybe did Senoreno, which is a lovely collection of midrashim, but they weren't allowed to, for whatever reason. I'm not commenting about what purpose this served or the value that it held or not. But the fact of the matter is that is the world that women lived in. And now let's talk about secular. Let's talk about the world at large. Until 100 years ago, give or take, no woman in any country, in any part of the world, in any time in history, was admitted to a university. This is not a Jewish thing. This is a thing. And voting is even less than 100 years in any part of the world, in any country, in any time. So I'm not, again, commenting about the dynamics behind this in sociology, and is it good and is it bad, and what role the Torah has in this, and all that. That is a very interesting conversation, but not today's conversation. But what I am saying is that the status of a woman was very different up until recently, and this differentness was a persistent and consistent state that went on for millennia, not a fad. So when the rabbis here are extremely careful to say that it is a positive thing to notice that the wife has desire and to fulfill that desire, even if there aren't any other considerations, and even if the person himself is not feeling particularly desirous, or there even aren't any lofty, motivations, that is a lofty motivation in and of itself. That is considered, according to the Ravid, the third advantageous, the third good intention, although less than the other two. And the final one that he talks about is simply that one's desire is getting so strong that he feels unable to manage it and feels distracted by that desire. And he says that that's really a good thing too. It's just not as high as the others. He also says that one should be wary about always gratifying a desire, because he does believe very deeply, and this is said with all seriousness. Again, I think it's hard for us who are exposed to so much to understand this mentality, but he says that if you gratify your desire, you're just going to keep going down a slippery slope, and before you know it, you're going to be committing idolatry. So that seems a little bit, I think, strange to the ears of a modern person, that there's so little self-control, and maybe we think differently, or maybe we delude ourselves, and perhaps we are as vulnerable as we think, or perhaps other types of sins we're very vulnerable to for different reasons. But the point is that the Ravid is saying that, and then he adds another thing too. He says there's really like a fifth level, which is like the fourth, which is that sometimes it's actually healthy for the body to be sexual. So what do we see over here? We see that there's an understanding that there are different levels of intention for sexuality, and that what we do understand is ultimately intention is important. And I think that's something to say. Meaning even the last level, where the person is saying, I'm so distracted by my physical desires that I can't think straight, and that I'm feeling somehow or another that it'll be curative or restorative, even that is something still less than lust. Because lust is just lust. This is saying that I believe that there's a constructive purpose, that I'm being mindful, that there's an intention here. And that is what I ultimately think is going on in all of this discussion, that the point is a person is a person and not an animal. And when two human beings are sexual, if they're only animals and they're only doing it out of lust, without any other premeditation, any other focus, any other thing, that itself is destructive. And I think that even in a very liberal society that we live in, and a society that's very sexual, I think many of us have the sensitivity to deep down intuit and feel that that's so. That being sexual and enjoying sex, which is not necessarily a problem, and certainly not technically forbidden, still needs to have a purpose and a value, a mindful intention, even if it's just to create love, even if it's just to create a bond. That is not just lustful, mindful sex.